On this episode of ESL Uncensored, Taiwan cannot buy love and friendship because when it comes to cash diplomacy, China is top gun. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of ESL Uncensored. So, since Tsai Ing-wen became Taiwan's president, it would appear that China has broken the diplomatic truce established by Ma Ying-jeou in 2008, a truce Beijing never officially agreed to. Interesting. Is it any surprise that Panama severed relations with Taiwan? I think those two need a room. Let's take a look at the history of Taiwan's diplomatic ties with other countries around the world. Panama, along with a few other countries, established ties with the Republic of China before the Chinese Civil War took place. You can look on Wikipedia for a full list of countries that recognized the ROC administration, when they established relations with the ROC, and when they broke off ties with them so they could establish ties with the so-called People's Republic of China. As of now, only 20 countries around the world recognize Taiwan. The Chinese Civil War began before Japan invaded China, and since China was already in a civil war, Japan had the upper hand. The Communists did almost nothing to fight the Japanese, while the KMT government did almost all the fighting. The Chinese were too weak to defeat the Japanese by themselves. Then, of course, the Americans and other Western allies came to fight the Japanese. If no other country was ever at war with Japan during that time, China to this day would still be under Japanese rule. The Communist Party went on a long march during the war, and any fighting that they did take part in, they would have left it to the very last minute so that if the Japanese could be defeated, why not let the KMT do most of the fighting so that more KMT soldiers could be killed in the war, so that when the Civil War resumes, there would be less KMT soldiers for the CCP to fight against. Kinda like how in that TV show Reboot, when Megabyte sits by and waits for the CPUs to fight the web creatures, so that many CPUs will be destroyed first, and therefore making it easier for the ABCs to defeat the CPUs later, giving Megabyte total air supremacy.
I thought your forces were coping admirably, but if you wish...
Commander, I want everything in the air supporting the CPUs.
Supporting the CPUs? Yes, sir.
Commander, destroy the remaining spores, then blow the CPUs out of the sky. I want total air supremacy.
Mayday! Mayday! We're under attack! Repeat, the ABCs are attacking us!
Thank you all for your valiant efforts in fighting the web. Unfortunately,
It was all for nothing. As we speak, your CPUs are being shot out of the sky. Fong, drop all defenses on the principal office. And welcome to Mega Frame.
I love it when he talks like that.
Anyway, the KMT had a weaker army after Japan surrendered, and many surrendering Japanese troops were recruited into the so-called People's Liberation Army. The KMT invades and occupies Taiwan in 1947 and establishes the Republic of China capital in Taipei. In 1949, the KMT loses and retreats all remaining forces to Taiwan. After the ROC government fled to Taiwan, the KMT administration had plenty of chances for dual recognition. However, they insisted on a One China policy since the KMT had plans to invade China and bring China back under ROC rule. Time itself proved it to be impossible. The Republic of China was in fact one of the founding members of the United Nations, and at the end of the Civil War, Taipei had UN membership as well as a seat on the UN Security Council. Most countries at the time recognized Taipei. However, China grew more powerful, and as time went on and over the decades since 1949, countries one after the other shifted their recognition to Beijing and acknowledged Beijing's One China policy. In 1971, the UN decided to switch recognition from Taipei to Beijing. At that time, Taiwan's veto power at the UN Security Council had no say. Anyway, back to current day events. So, Panama severed relations with Taiwan, but yet Panama offered to do so roughly around 2008 or 2009-ish. According to WikiLeaks anyway. It's interesting to note that when Costa Rica severed relations with Taiwan in 2007, Panama at the time reiterated their ties with Taipei despite growing trade interest in China. In April 2007, St. Lucia established ties with Taiwan, and at the time both Taipei and St. Lucia agreed dual recognition for both Taiwan and China. Unfortunately, Beijing did not accept that idea. However, China did not sever ties until 2 weeks later. During the 2 weeks when St. Lucia had official ties to both Taiwan and China at the same time, Beijing offered large sums of money to the country, and St. Lucia turned down the offer. 2 weeks after the ROC Taiwan embassy was established in St. Lucia, Beijing shut theirs down. Interestingly enough, a Chinese spokesperson criticizes the move and accuses Taiwan of using cash diplomacy. I guess cash diplomacy doesn't always work. For example, Taiwan's remaining 2 African allies turned down Beijing's money offers. I guess their economic trade with Taiwan and other countries around them must be good enough. Now let's look at Malawi. The funny thing about Malawi is that they severed relations with Taiwan in January 2008, only weeks before Ma Ying-jeou became president. January 2009 comes along and the Malawi president expresses regret for switching ties. I guess Beijing didn't offer a good enough deal to the country, and the president even said switching ties to Beijing was one of the worst mistakes he ever made. But since the unofficial diplomatic truce was already in place, Taiwan did not forge official ties with Malawi when they had the chance. Even more interesting, the money, which I think was about $6 million US, some official got a hold of it somehow and left the country. Funny how that works. The cash diplomacy that Beijing gave Malawi as a reward for cutting ties with Taiwan is now gone. Since Taiwan is an isolated country in a diplomatic sense, is it possible for Taiwan to gain the international recognition they deserve? There are a few possibilities, but since China is a massive power, they do risk a possible invasion if a large-scale recognition of Taiwan does happen. Not certain if China would actually do anything, since Taiwan has missiles aiming back at China, which would in fact cripple the Chinese economy. One way for Taiwan to be recognized is if the United States drops the One China policy and brings in a more realistic dual recognition policy for both Taiwan and China. America would have to recognize Taiwan first. Then the United States would have to pressure every country on Earth possible to follow through and also recognize Taiwan. Normally, when a country does establish ties with Taiwan, China generally severs relations with that country. But because Beijing needs official relations with the United States for too many reasons which have nothing to do with Taiwan, there is no way Beijing would ever cut ties with the United States. If America would pressure other countries around the world to recognize Taiwan, odd countries in Europe, Africa, and Latin America would be a start. Eventually, other countries would follow through. Now, since Beijing is a far more influential power than what they were back in the 1970s, many countries around the world would actually remain committed to Beijing's One China policy. But if America did make that change, and if they did pressure countries around the world to follow through, by my estimation, I would say that at the very least, Taiwan in the long run would have close to maybe 55 countries recognizing them. Another possible way that Taiwan could get the recognition they deserve is if their useless ally, the Vatican, acted upon it. The Vatican is a small city with somewhat of a quasi-level statehood inside Rome, and it is the head of the entire Catholic Church worldwide. With millions, if not billions, of Catholic followers, the Vatican could endorse a global boycott made in China campaign as part of a global Taiwan recognition campaign. It would be very difficult at first, since almost everything these days is made in China. With enough efforts among the Catholic followers worldwide under the Vatican orders, they could start engaging in other social and economic activities to promote economic and bilateral trade with countries that do recognize Taiwan as well as with Taiwan itself. At the same time, raise money to fund the construction of factories in other countries besides China, where labor is also cheap, and with a Boycott Made in China campaign, there would be less products made in China. The international economy would become more competitive for China, and China would lose their economic influence within the world. Loss of economic influence would mean loss of political influence. China would lose their ability to influence countries on issues that Beijing cares about so much, things which have nothing to do with Taiwan. Since the Vatican is an ally to Taiwan, I am surprised that they don't really do anything for them, considering the billions of people worldwide that follow them. I would say that the Vatican does nothing for Taiwan and therefore is a useless ally. What about the United Nations? If the United States did officially recognize Taiwan, America and other countries under US pressure may try assisting Taiwan to enter the UN. China's UN Security Council status with veto power alone is not enough to keep Taiwan out. Here's why. Before 1971, when the ROC administration in Taiwan was in the UN, Taiwan at the time had a seat on the UN Security Council. They had veto power as Beijing does today. Mongolia entered the UN in the 1950s. The ROC constitution claimed sovereignty over Mongolia along with China. Taiwan's veto power at the UN Security Council was not able to keep Mongolia out. In 1971, when the UN decided to recognize Beijing over Taipei, again, Taiwan's UN Security Council seat and veto power had no effect. After Taiwan was kicked out of the UN in 1971, Beijing got a seat at the UN Security Council. However, through the mid-1970s, top US government officials such as George H.W. Bush, who at the time was the American ambassador to the UN as well as the odd European country, would urge Taiwan to accept dual recognition. If Taiwan was actually smart enough to accept dual recognition, America would have been able to get Taiwan back into the UN, and enough countries at the time actually recognized Taiwan to the point where China's UN Security Council status and veto power would have never been enough to keep Taiwan out. What about today? The difference between the 1970s and today's world is that China has way more massive economic power and influence in the world, which is why I wish that the Vatican would work using all of their followers worldwide to suppress China's economic power as explained earlier. Not only does China have UN Security Council status with veto power today, but because of China's massive economic power, there would be other countries under Chinese pressure at the UN fighting against Taiwan. So if America did drop the One China policy, Taiwan may get more international recognition, but it's unlikely to lead to UN recognition. At the same time, if America and other countries could somehow get Taiwan into the United Nations, I also believe that it would be hard for Taiwan to actually thrive in it. All of the UN-affiliated activities that go on, China would pressure other countries at the UN to single out or at least undermine Taiwan in whatever activities that go on in the UN. Which is why I kind of believe that UN membership for Taiwan may not do Taiwan any good. If there's anything Taiwan needs, they need to triple the amount of Brave Wind 3 missiles they have aiming at China. America needs to arm Taiwan with high-speed railguns and the THAAD missile system, nuclear weapons, as well as the diesel-electric submarines that Taiwan wanted for so long, along with diplomatic recognition, of course. So, what do you think of Taiwan's diplomatic isolation? Leave your comments below. See you next time.